Today on the Perception and Action podcast, is there one optimal movement solution for any given task? If not, can we identify the optimal movement pattern for each individual? How can knowledge of performance feedback be used to achieve optimality? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I want to try to address the questions, what is an optimal movement pattern, and how do we know when we've found it? Not surprisingly, the answers really depend on the theoretical approach to skill acquisition we adopt. So let's take a look. One approach we can take to address these questions is based on the traditional information processing theory of skill acquisition. For example, consider the expert performance-based approach proposed by Erickson and Smith in 1991. The basic idea here is that an optimal movement pattern is what expert performers do. In the expert performance-based approach, the first stage is to identify which characteristics of a perceptual motor behavior discriminate experts from lower levels of performance. Skill acquisition then involves a novice working towards acquiring these characteristics through deliberate practice. A specific example of this can be seen in gaze behavior research, which has attempted to improve performance by training performers to adopt the visual search strategies shown by experts. For example, getting them to look at particular places on an opponent's body, or quiet eye training. A basic assumption in this approach is that there's one optimal movement pattern for each skill, with some key invariant features that we can identify. A good example of using this approach in training is the 1991 study by Schmidt and Young. In this study, the authors looked at knowledge of performance or KP feedback. The hypothesis they sought to test was that providing new learners with KP feedback that was based on the movement solution used by the best performer, in other words, the one expert movement solution, would result in better skill acquisition. To test this idea, a coincidence anticipation task was used. This task is basically meant to be a laboratory version of hitting. In it, a series of small lights are turned on in a sequence to simulate a moving object. The participant's task is to pull back a lever, then let it go so that it arrives at a light strip at the instant the nearest light is turned on, at the coincident point. The goal of the task is to maximize scores, which are calculated as a function of the velocity of the lever at the coincident point and the absolute spatial error of the lever from the coincident point in degrees. Even though the lever movement has only a single degree of freedom, many independent features of the movement pattern, such as the onset time of movement, the reversal position, that is when the participant begins moving it forward, the waiting time at this position, the onset time of the forward swing, and the velocity of the lever must be controlled by the participant. After each trial, angular displacement and velocity profiles of the movement, serving as KP feedback, and the score, serving as knowledge of results or KR feedback, were displayed on a computer screen. In the Schmidt and Young study, two groups were compared, one that received only KR feedback and a group that received both KR and KP. The key element of the study was that the KP feedback was based on the movement behavior used by the participant that had the highest score in a preliminary study. Specifically, in the training study, participants were shown the trace of their own movement, in particular the reversal position and onset time of the forward swing of the lever, superimposed on the trace of the best performer's movement, and they were told to try and match these movement profiles. So in other words, the participants in the study were trained to adopt one ideal movement solution. It was found that this training group did do significantly better at retention as compared to the group that only had KR feedback. A limitation of the study is, of course, we don't know whether it's the presence of KP itself or training to have an expert movement pattern that resulted in better performance because only one KP group was used. This shortcoming was addressed in a 1996 follow-up study by Brisson and Alain. This study used the identical coincidence anticipation task. It consisted of two experiments using the same 14 participants in each. In the first experiment, participants performed two sets of 100 acquisition trials. Feedback provided after each trial included the score, KR, as well as KP in the form of the displacement and velocity profiles of the movement just performed. Participants were informed that they could use this information provided to try and figure out how to maximize their scores. From this, the movement pattern used by the participant that had the highest overall score was identified. In experiment 2, the same set of participants were trained in 2 separate sessions of 100 trials each. In both of these, the KP feedback involves showing how the movement pattern used on the previous trial compared to a template pattern. In one of the training sessions, the template was the movement pattern associated with the best score of the best performing participant, in other words, the quote-unquote expert movement pattern. In the other training session, the Criterion template was the movement pattern associated with each participant's own personal best score. The order of these 2 training sessions was counterbalanced across participants. Finally, after training, retention tests of 40 trials without feedback were conducted 24 hours after each training session. What was found? First, it should be noted that participants were able to meet the initial requirements of the best subject's template pattern, such as the reversal position, waiting time at this position, and onset time of the forward swing. So in other words, when trained to do so, participants could adopt the quote-unquote optimal movement pattern. But did it help their performance? In a word, no. In looking just at the scores, there was no significant difference between the 2 types of training in either the acquisition or retention phases. However, there were differences on 2 other measures, but in the opposite direction to what would have been predicted based on the expert performance approach. Specifically, when the authors looked at the really bad trials in which the lever completely missed the target and resulted in a score of 0, it was found that these trials occurred significantly less often when participants trained using their own personal best template. Similarly, it was found that participants became more consistent over the training trials when they used their own personal template, and more variable when trying to reproduce the best participant's template. To sum up this part of the episode, these 2 studies I've just described are pretty indicative of research that has looked at training towards developing one optimal movement pattern. It's kind of a mixed bag of results and doesn't provide a lot of support for this idea. In gaze behavior research, attempts to train a novice to adopt the visual search pattern of an expert, look here, then look there, have generally not been very successful. For an example of this, check out episode 24C, where I discussed a study of gaze training in beach volleyball. But at the same time, quiet eye training, in which novices are taught to fixate longer before moving, a pattern seen in expert, has shown to be highly successful in improving performance, as discussed in episode 3. Finally, another example of where trying to get a novice to adopt one optimal movement pattern doesn't seem to work is in guided or assisted movement training. For example, using a robot to move a novice through the optimal swing path of an expert. I discussed research showing that this really doesn't work very well back in episode 96. The alternative theoretical approach associated with ecological and dynamical approaches is, of course, that there is not one optimal movement pattern for a given sport skill. To quote Newell, the optimal pattern of coordination and control for a given individual is specified by the interaction of organismic, environmental, and task constraints, and that the quote, optimal pattern of coordination and control for a given task will be individual specific, end quote. In terms of taking into account the individual constraints of a performer, one promising approach that has been used is forward biomechanical modeling. In this approach, the inputs of the model are typically forces or torques applied on our body, while the outputs are kinematic data describing the motion of our different body segments. Simulations can then be run to determine the optimal movement pattern in terms of the forces applied and positions of our body parts to achieve a particular goal. Individual variations in the solution come from the fact that many of the models also include measurements of the lengths of our different body parts and segments as inputs. These models, of course, can vary greatly in their complexity, but as an example of a fairly simple one, consider the model of throwing developed by Herring and Chapman in 1992. This model included 3 body segments, the upper arm, forearm, and hand. The length of these different segments could vary depending on the individual, and inertial properties and realistic ranges of motion were used. The simulation involved identifying the optimal movement pattern for throwing a 180-gram ball. The maximum speed attained by the ball and the distance it would travel if released at the optimal time were calculated for each combination of times of torque onset. It was found that the ball could be thrown furthest if the elbow torque started 100 milliseconds after the shoulder torque, and the wrist torque 40 milliseconds later. If and how this varied depending on the individual was not really discussed, so in the end this really was closer to the one optimal movement solution approach. A couple great articles discussing the use of biomechanical models for identifying optimal movement patterns have come from Paul Glazier and colleagues. In the first, the 2009 paper, it is argued that feed-forward biomechanical modeling, no matter how complex the model, is very unlikely to be successful in identifying the complete optimal solution for a given motor action, because existing models are far too limited in the way they incorporate constraints. Many of the concerns raised mirror the critiques of traditional information processing approaches to skill. When we shift our conceptualization of human perceptual motor control from a deterministic system driven by a central executive to a complex, adaptive, self-organizing system, it radically changes our view of what the outputs of a feed-forward model would even look like. In particular, in existing models, it's very difficult to account for the pleiotropic and degenerate nature of the system. Pleiotropy, there's a new word of the day for you and me, refers to our ability to use the many degrees of freedom available in our motor system for different roles. Quote from the article, "Pleiotropy instills inherent backup in a metastable complex system, that is, systems that switch continuously between states of stability and instability, by providing a number of different options to support the search for alternative behavioral solutions." End quote. A specific example of this is that in some situations, the same body segments and degrees of freedom that serve a stability function in one movement can provide a more mobility function in another. So in a nutshell, pleiotropic means the same things can have different roles. Degeneracy, which I've already talked about on the podcast a few times now, is the opposite. It refers to the ability of different things to serve the same role. That is, we can use different movement solutions or combinations of degrees of freedom to satisfy the same set of constraints. Quote, "Degeneracy refers to the capacity of structurally different components of complex neurobiological systems to achieve different outcomes in varying contexts." End quote. Putting this all together, quote, "Characteristics such as complexity, pleiotropy, and degeneracy make it challenging to identify a common optimal movement solution for all performers, requiring a remodeling of movement behavior in dynamic performance contexts." End quote. One promising approach to addressing this challenge is something I talked about a couple weeks ago, coordinative structure. So the idea here is that instead of trying to model all the degrees of freedom in terms of joint angles, torques, etc., we develop a model of the higher level structures which serve to coordinate them, similar to the baseball batting model I discussed. Quote from the article, "The soft assembly of coordinative structures is a feature of neurobiological complexity, affording great flexibility and adaptability as individual muscles can participate in different coordinative structures on different occasions." End quote. Soft assembly refers to the ability to assemble and deassemble coordinative structures based on the particular constraints being faced. Another key to this endeavor, in Glaser and David's view, is taking in a broader conceptualization of individual or organismic constraints. In Newell's model, organismic constraints can be subdivided into structural and functional constraints. Structural constraints are physical constraints that remain relatively constant over time and include things like height, body mass, the anthropometric and inertial characteristics of the torso and limbs, ranges of motion, etc. In general, biomechanical models for optimization have done a good job incorporating structural constraints, but the functional constraints are lacking. Functional constraints have a relatively faster rate of change and can be either physical or psychological. These include intentions, emotions, and decision-making. To quote Newell, "Optimization modeling has been largely confined to consideration of mechanical constraints. However, mechanical constraints are clearly not sufficient criteria for optimization in biological systems, although they represent an important beginning to this effort." End quote. Finally, a related limitation is that very few models have been developed that incorporate both perceptual information and motor control. A couple notable examples are the work by people like Peter Beek and James Trizilian and colleagues on interception, which I'll be discussing in more detail in future episodes. Also, please see the Glaser and David's article for more examples of attempts to incorporate different constraints into optimization models. Another key idea for taking a dynamical constraints approach to optimization is Newell's concept of self-organizing optimally, which has also been called constrained optimization in theoretical biology. To quote Glaser and Davids, "Constrained optimization states that the behavior of a biological system at any given time will always be optimal for the specific confluence of constraints acting on the system. Or stated another way, the system will always do the best it can." End quote. Note there's a very important point that often gets missed here. The task goal in any situation is just one of the constraints facing a performer. Therefore, quote, even though the pattern of coordination and control produced by the neuromuscular skeletal system might be optimal in relation to the immediately imposed constraints, the performance outcomes could still be suboptimal or unsuccessful. End quote. The key in a dynamical systems approach is we're not using an external independent criterion to judge the optimality of coordination. Instead, quote, since the constraints imposed on an individual dynamical movement system can fluctuate continuously over time, the optimal movement pattern of coordination and control for any given motor activity can change accordingly. Furthermore, as the conscious and subconscious interpretation of these constraints is dependent on the intrinsic dynamics, that is, the preferred states of coordination and control based on neuromuscular skeletal system architecture, genetic composition, previous task experience, emotions, etc., of each individual under scrutiny, optimal patterns of coordination and control for any given motor activity will always be individual specific. End quote. The final article I want to look at today is a recent commentary published by Glazier and colleagues in the Journal of Biomechanics. If we accept that optimal movement patterns are individual specific, the next question, of course, becomes, can we identify the optimal pattern for a given individual? This has sometimes been called the optimum technique and defined as motions yielding a maximal performance under given constraining conditions for a given individual. Again, it has been proposed that this can be achieved through biomechanical optimization models. But in the commentary, the authors raise some doubts about this endeavor as well. As we've just seen, to identify an athlete-specific optimal solution, dynamical systems theory suggests that a representative set of organismic constraints, along with their nonlinear characteristics, needs to be identified and incorporated into the mathematical model of the athlete. However, a quote from the article, whether the athlete will be able to adopt and reliably reproduce his or her predicted optimum technique will be largely dependent on his or her intrinsic dynamics. If the attractor valley corresponding to the existing technique is deep, or if the attractor valleys corresponding to the existing technique and the predicted optimum technique are in different topological regions of the dynamic landscape, technical modifications may be challenging or impossible to reliably implement, even after extended practice. The attractor layout defining the intrinsic dynamics of the athlete therefore needs to be determined to establish the likelihood of the predicted optimum technique being reliably attainable by the athlete. End quote. Another way to put this, and referring to last week's episode, is even if we could identify the location in the perceptual motor workspace that would result in the optimal performance for a given individual, we would need to know if there's a path that it can actually use to get there by better understanding the layout of the workspace and the process of search that moves an athlete through it and eventually deforms it. To sum up today's topic, I obviously have a theoretical bias here, but in my opinion, there are abundant reasons to believe that there's no one optimal movement solution for a given task or sport skill. So I think the best answer to the first question I pose, what is an optimal movement solution, is Newell's definition, a solution that optimally satisfies the current constraints imposed on an individual performer. But as I've tried to emphasize today through the articles of Paul Glazier and colleagues, this unfortunately does not give a very satisfying answer to my second question. How do we know when we found the optimal solution for a given performer? Because most existing models include a very narrow range of constraints and don't really consider the stability and preference for particular states of coordination, shaped by the intrinsic dynamics of the performer, it seems like a lot more work needs to be done before we can achieve this goal. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including an extra monthly episode and written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.